The diplomatic hall aboard the Galactic Assembly Station was filled with representatives from 40 different alien species. Among them stood Lieutenant Maya Collins, a human officer from Earth's Stellar Navy who worked as a junior attaché to the human delegation. She had been warned that humanity's new membership in the Assembly would come with challenges. But nothing prepared her for the cold looks and dismissive attitudes she encountered every single day. The evening's entertainment had just finished with an amazing performance by the Veldari Choir. Their crystalline voices created harmonies that seemed almost magical. As the applause died down, Ambassador Krell of the Veldari delegation turned his strange, multifaceted eyes toward the human section. With what looked like a mean smile, Krell announced, loudly so everyone could hear, that he understood humans' claim to have artistic abilities. Perhaps one of the human delegation would honor them with a demonstration. The other delegates whispered to each other with barely hidden amusement. Everyone knew that the Veldari considered themselves the best musicians in the entire galaxy, and this was clearly meant to embarrass the humans. Ambassador Richard Hayes, the head of the human delegation, kept his face calm despite the obvious trap. Before he could say anything, Krell continued by pointing directly at Maya. "The young one there," he said. He had been told humans learn various primitive instruments. Surely she could provide them with some entertainment. Maya felt her stomach drop like a stone. She had played violin as a child, yes, but she had not touched the instrument in nearly 8 years since joining the military academy. This was clearly a setup, a way to humiliate the newest members of the assembly by forcing an unprepared performance before the galaxy's cultural elite. She could see the calculation in Krell's expression, the way other delegates leaned forward expecting human failure. Maya began to say she was not prepared to perform, but Krell waved a dismissive appendage. "Nonsense," he said. "They had a violin in their collection of primitive instruments. Unless," he paused with meaning, "humans were too afraid of their own abilities to accept a simple cultural exchange." The challenge hung in the air like a sharp knife. To refuse would confirm every negative belief about humanity's inferiority. To accept would likely result in an embarrassing failure that would damage diplomatic relations for years to come. Ambassador Hayes caught her eye and gave the smallest nod. The decision was hers to make, but he would support whatever choice she made. Maya took a deep breath, feeling the weight of humanity's reputation settling heavy on her shoulders like a physical burden. "Very well," she said quietly but clearly. She would accept the challenge. The instrument they brought her was clearly designed to make her fail. It was technically a violin, one apparently taken from an Earth merchant vessel many decades ago. But it had been poorly maintained and stored in terrible conditions. The strings were old and tarnished. The bow hair was brittle and uneven in places. It was meant to fail, just as she was meant to fail in front of all these powerful aliens. Maya took the instrument carefully in her hands. Her fingers found familiar positions despite the years away from any formal practice. The weight of it felt both strange and right at the same time, awakening muscle memories she thought were long forgotten. Around her, the assembly hall had grown completely silent with expectation. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, representing species from across the entire galaxy, all waiting and expecting to witness human mediocrity or worse. Lieutenant Jake Morrison from her own ship caught her eye from the human delegation section. He mouthed something that looked like encouragement, though his expression showed his doubt about the situation. Nobody expected her to salvage this terrible situation. The best she could hope for was to minimize the embarrassment, to perform something simple and safe that would not disgrace Earth too badly in front of all these ancient civilizations. Ambassador Krell leaned back in his seat, his posture showing smug satisfaction. "Whenever you are ready, Lieutenant," he said with false politeness. "We understand if this is beyond your current capabilities." The other Veldari delegates made a sound like wind chimes, which Maya had learned was their version of laughter at someone else's expense. She tested the strings quietly, wincing internally at how badly out of tune the instrument was after years of neglect. Under normal circumstances, she would spend at least 20 minutes carefully tuning and preparing before any performance. But these were not normal circumstances, and there was no time for proper preparation. She would have to adjust as she played, compensating for the instrument's many flaws through technique alone, if that was even possible. Maya said she would need a moment of silence to prepare her mind. She closed her eyes, blocking out the audience, the expectations, the political implications of failure. She thought back to her childhood, to the small music school in Colorado where her grandmother had first placed a violin in her small hands at age 5. Her grandmother had been a music teacher, a woman who believed that art was humanity's greatest achievement, more important than any technological advancement or military victory. Music, she used to say with passion, is how we speak to the soul of the universe itself. When you play, Maya, you are not just moving a bow across strings. You are translating human emotion into something universal that everyone can understand, regardless of language or species. Maya opened her eyes and looked at the sea of alien faces watching her. She knew exactly what she had to play, not something simple or safe that would barely register, but something that would show these assembled species exactly what humans were truly capable of when they were underestimated and pushed into a corner. She raised the violin to her shoulder with growing confidence, positioned the damaged bow carefully, and made her choice. She would play something impossible, something that would either redeem humanity or confirm every doubt these aliens had about Earth's worthiness. There would be no middle ground, no safe mediocrity. She would risk everything on one performance with a broken instrument she had never seen before this moment. The fate of human dignity in the galactic community rested on what happened in the next few minutes. The piece Maya had chosen was Saracyte's Zigeunerweisen, a virtuoso showpiece that had terrified her as a student and that she had not attempted in many years. It was a completely ridiculous choice, an impossible choice given the terrible circumstances. But as her grandmother used to say with a knowing smile, if you are going to fail, you should fail spectacularly so at least people remember your courage. The opening notes were soft and tentative, a gypsy melody that spoke of distant campfires and forgotten roads traveled long ago. The violin's poor condition was immediately obvious in the thin, scratchy quality of the sound it produced, and she saw Krell's smug expression deepen with satisfaction. Around the hall, delegates shifted in their seats with disappointment, having expected at least something more impressive from the species that had somehow developed faster than light travel in such a short time. But Maya was just beginning her performance. Her fingers found the positions automatically, muscle memory taking over and overriding conscious thought. She began to compensate for the instrument's many flaws, adjusting pressure and angle carefully, coaxing decent tone from the resistant strings. The melody grew stronger, developing from that tentative opening into something bolder and more confident with each passing measure. Then she hit the first technical passage, and everything in the room changed completely. Her bow became a blur of motion across the strings as the piece exploded into a cascade of rapid notes, faster and faster, her left hand flying up and down the fingerboard in positions that should have been impossible on such a poorly maintained instrument. The scratchy quality did not disappear entirely, but it transformed into something else, becoming part of the voice of the music itself, adding a raw and almost desperate quality to the virtuosic display of skill. Lieutenant Morrison's mouth had fallen completely open in shock. He had known Maya for 3 full years and had absolutely no idea she possessed this level of skill. Around the hall, the casual dismissiveness was evaporating like morning mist, replaced by focused attention from every delegate present. Even the Veldari delegates had stopped their wind chime laughter, leaning forward in their seats with what looked like genuine surprise. Maya was no longer consciously aware of being in the diplomatic hall. In her mind, she was back in her grandmother's small studio, 14 years old, finally mastering this incredibly difficult piece after months of frustrated practice and tears. She remembered the exact moment when it had clicked, when the seemingly impossible passages had suddenly made perfect sense, when she had realized that the key was not to fight the difficulty, but to embrace it fully, to let the challenge become an integral part of the performance itself. The piece shifted into its lyrical middle section, and Maya poured every single ounce of emotion she had been holding back into the melody. This was the voice of humanity speaking, not through words or weapons or advanced technology, but through pure artistic expression that needed no translation. Every frustration she had felt at being underestimated, every slight humanity had endured since joining the assembly, every moment of doubt and fear channeled directly into the ancient instrument in her hands. The violin sang despite its obvious flaws, or perhaps in some strange way because of them. There was something brutally honest in its imperfect voice, something raw and real that the Veldari's perfect crystalline harmonies could never truly capture. Maya felt tears forming in her eyes, but she did not stop playing for even a moment. The music demanded absolutely everything from her. and she gave it willingly without reservation or holding back. As Maya transitioned into the final movement of the piece, something extraordinary began to happen in the hall. The acoustic properties of the assembly chamber, originally designed to enhance the natural harmonics of Veldari singing, started responding to her playing in completely unexpected ways. The old violin's imperfect resonance created strange overtones that the hall's architecture amplified and transformed into something new. What emerged was something none of the assembled delegates had ever experienced before in their long lives. The music seemed to take on an almost physical presence, filling every corner of the vast chamber with sound. Species with hearing ranges far beyond human perception found themselves detecting harmonics they had never encountered in any musical form. The Krell, whose species perceived sound through temperature changes in their skin, felt the notes as waves of warmth and cool that painted emotional landscapes they could not put into words. Ambassador Krell's smug expression had completely vanished from his face. He sat frozen in his seat, his crystalline facets seeming to resonate with the music itself in visible patterns. Around him, other Veldari delegates had entered what could only be described as a trance state, their bodies swaying unconsciously to rhythms their conscious minds could not anticipate or predict. But it was not just the Veldari who were affected by the performance. Commander Lisa Barnes from the Earth delegation had tears streaming freely down her face, remembering something from her childhood she could not quite name. The Thaxian representative, whose species had no musical tradition at all in their entire history, found himself understanding for the first time in his life why other civilizations valued such seemingly purposeless sounds. Maya's technique had somehow transcended the physical limitations of the damaged instrument. Where the strings were most damaged, she adjusted her vibrato to compensate, turning flaws into deliberate features. Where the bow was uneven and damaged, she used the irregularity to create accents and emphasis that a perfect bow might never achieve. She was no longer simply playing the violin in the traditional sense, she was collaborating with it, accepting its brokenness completely and incorporating it into the art itself. The final passage approached rapidly, the infamous descending cascade that had broken the spirits of countless students over the centuries. 30-second notes tumbling over each other in a seemingly impossible sequence, requiring absolute precision and unwavering physical stamina. Maya's arm ached terribly. Her fingers were cramping with the strain, but she pushed through the pain, driven by something far beyond mere physical capability or technique. In that crystallized moment, Maya understood what her grandmother had tried to teach her all those years ago. This was not about proving human superiority or salvaging diplomatic relations with alien species. This was about the thing that made humanity unique in a galaxy full of elder species with superior technology and far longer histories. Humans felt things deeply, irrationally and passionately in ways that other species could not understand. They could take pain and somehow transform it into beauty. They could be broken into pieces and still create something whole and meaningful. This was the gift humanity brought to the galaxy, not superior weapons or faster ships, but the ability to find meaning in struggle itself. The final note rang out clear and strong despite everything working against it. Maya held the bow perfectly steady, letting the note decay naturally, letting the hall's strange acoustics carry it gradually into silence. Only then did she finally lower the instrument, her breath coming in gasps, her entire body trembling with complete exhaustion. The silence that followed her performance was absolute and complete. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, nobody in the entire hall moved at all. The assembled delegates sat in stunned quiet, as if afraid that any sound would somehow shatter the lingering presence of what they had just witnessed. Maya stood alone in the center of the massive hall, still holding the battered violin carefully, suddenly very aware of the hundreds of alien eyes fixed upon her with an intensity she had never experienced before. Then Ambassador Krell stood up slowly from his seat. Deliberately and with great ceremony, he raised his forward appendages and brought them together in a gesture that the Veldari almost never performed for species outside their own. It was their highest possible acknowledgement of artistic merit, reserved only for performances that transcended mere technical skill to touch something fundamental and true about existence itself. The sound of his clapping, a crystalline chiming that rang through the hall like temple bells, broke the spell completely. Within seconds, the entire assembly was on their feet in a standing ovation. The Thaxians drummed their chest plates in rhythmic approval, The Xanthi waved their bioluminescent light organs in complex patterns of deep respect. And the humans, led by Ambassador Hayes, applauded with a thunder that Maya felt vibrating in her bones. Lieutenant Morrison was openly crying, not from sadness but from a pride so fierce it completely overwhelmed his usual composure. Commander Barnes had her hand over her mouth, shaking her head slowly in pure disbelief. Even the notoriously stoic Sentry delegates were making gestures of approval, their usually impassive faces showing something that might actually have been wonder. Krell approached Maya with careful steps, and she braced herself internally for some backhanded compliment or subtle dismissal of what had just happened. But when he spoke, his voice carried absolutely none of its earlier smugness or superiority. He said that he had lived for 4 of her human centuries, and in that vast time he had heard the greatest performers of 17 different species across the galaxy. What she had done here tonight, he paused, genuinely struggling for adequate words. There was a Veldari concept called Kreshva, which roughly translated as art born from survival and struggle. They had believed only Veldari could achieve it, because only they had known true hardship in their ancient history. He gestured toward the violin still in her trembling hands. She had taken an instrument deliberately designed to fail, and somehow made it sing with a voice that moved souls. She had taken her species' brief existence, their short lives and limited histories, and somehow distilled wisdom that they, who had existed for millennia, had forgotten or never learned. She had shown them Kreshva in its purest form. She had shown them that perhaps they had been completely wrong about humanity's place in the galaxy. Maya did not know what to say to this admission. She had walked into this hall just hours ago expecting to be a political pawn, a sacrifice to diplomatic necessity. Instead, something else had happened that she still did not fully understand. She had spoken for Earth in a language that transcended politics and species, and somehow, impossibly, the galaxy had actually understood her message. Ambassador Hayes joined them, his usually perfectly composed diplomatic face cracking into a genuine smile of triumph. Lieutenant Collins, he said warmly, she had just changed the entire nature of their ongoing negotiations. The Assembly had been debating whether to grant humans full voting rights or keep them as junior members for another full decade of probation. He strongly suspected that conversation was about to shift dramatically in humanity's favor, but Maya barely heard his words. She was looking down at the violin, this broken and neglected instrument that had somehow been enough when it mattered most. Her grandmother had been right all along about everything. Art was not about perfection or superiority, or proving yourself better than others. It was about truth, about taking whatever you had, however flawed and broken, and creating something meaningful and beautiful from it. The cultural exchange ceremony was supposed to end immediately after the performances, but nobody in attendance seemed willing to leave the hall. Delegates who had been cold and dismissive toward the human contingent just hours before now approached with genuine curiosity, lighting their alien features. The change in atmosphere was palpable and dramatic, as if Maya's performance had somehow rewritten the social dynamics of the entire assembly in one evening. A Xanthi diplomat named Velshara glided over gracefully, her bioluminescent patterns pulsing with colors that Maya's briefing materials had indicated meant deep respect and admiration. The Xanthi had spent 3,000 years perfecting their famous light symphonies, she said in the musical tones of her species' language, translated by the universal device at her throat. They believed they had achieved the ultimate form of aesthetic expression. But Maya's performance had shown them that perfection might actually be less valuable than they thought. There was power in imperfection and visible struggle. This realization was truly revolutionary. More delegates gathered around Maya in a growing circle, and she found herself at the unexpected center of a crowd that wanted to understand not just the music itself, but what it meant about humanity as a species. How had such a young species, barely into space exploration, developed such emotional depth in their art? What other capabilities might humans possess that the Assembly had completely overlooked in their rush to judgment? Ambassador Hayes skillfully worked the enthusiastic crowd, turning Maya's unexpected triumph into immediate diplomatic opportunity. She watched him operate with new appreciation, understanding now how much pressure he must have been under to prove humanity's worth to these ancient civilizations. One violin performance would not solve all of Earth's complex political challenges, but it had opened doors that had been firmly closed just hours before. Lieutenant Morrison finally managed to push through the growing crowd to reach her side. Maya, he said with genuine confusion mixed with awe. What the hell was that? 3 years serving on the same ship together, and she had never once mentioned she could play like that. His voice mixed wonder with playful accusation. Maya shrugged tiredly, feeling sudden exhaustion wash over her in waves. It never came up in normal conversation, she explained. And honestly, Jake, she did not know she still could play at that level. She had not played seriously since she was 16 years old. Tonight was something she could not explain. She trailed off, unable to find adequate words for what tonight had actually been. Impossible, Jake suggested with a grin spreading across his face. Miraculous, perhaps. Completely insane, definitely. He shook his head in amazement. She knew this was going to change absolutely everything, right? Not just for diplomatic stuff with the Assembly. Every human out here in space just saw one of their own take on the Veldari's challenge and win decisively. That mattered deeply. That meant something powerful to people who had been feeling like second-class citizens in the Assembly. Maya had not thought about it that way at all. She had been so intensely focused on the immediate challenge that she had not considered the broader implications for humanity. There were thousands of humans scattered across assembly stations and territories, many of them facing the same subtle discrimination she had experienced daily. Her performance would not end that prejudice overnight, but it provided something equally important and lasting. It was proof that humans belonged here, that they had something unique and valuable to contribute to galactic civilization. Commander Barnes approached with a knowing smile on her experienced face. "Congratulations, Lieutenant," she said warmly. Maya had just become the most famous human in the entire assembly. How did it feel to carry that weight? Terrifying, Maya admitted with complete honesty. She had just wanted to not embarrass Earth in front of these ancient species. She did not mean to accidentally start a cultural revolution that would change human standing in the galaxy. Barnes laughed with genuine amusement. "Welcome to the reality of diplomacy," she said. "The most significant moments are rarely the ones we carefully plan for. They are the ones where real people show who they really are under extreme pressure." Maya had done exactly that tonight. She had shown them what humanity looks like when they are pushed to their absolute limits and refuse to break. An hour later, the crowd had finally dispersed enough for Maya to escape to one of the station's quiet observation decks. She desperately needed space to process everything that had happened, to come down from the intense adrenaline high of performance and its completely unexpected aftermath. She still held the old violin carefully, unwilling to let it out of her sight. She was not alone in the quiet space for very long. Ambassador Krell found her standing there at the massive viewport that looked out onto the infinite darkness between distant stars. For a long moment they stood together in comfortable silence, two beings from wildly different worlds, somehow connected by something neither of them fully understood or could explain. "May I ask you something?" Lieutenant Collins, Krell's voice had lost all its earlier arrogance, replaced by genuine curiosity. When she began playing, she knew the instrument was badly flawed. She knew she was completely unprepared. Why did she choose such a technically difficult piece? Why not play something safer that would minimize the risk? Maya thought carefully about her answer before speaking. "Because safe was not going to prove anything to anyone," she explained. He already believed humans were inferior before she played a single note. A safe, simple performance would have just confirmed that belief. But a difficult piece, even if she failed completely at it, she smiled slightly. At least he would know they tried their best. That humans were not afraid of the challenge, but she did not fail, Krell observed quietly. "No," Maya agreed simply. "But she did not know she would not fail when she started. That is what makes it matter, that is what makes it meaningful." Krell made a sound like crystal wind chimes, which Maya had learned was Veldari laughter, but this time it held absolutely no mockery. Her species was very strange to him, he admitted. The Veldari spent centuries perfecting their art before they would ever perform publicly. The idea of attempting something with such high risk of failure in front of a critical audience, he seemed genuinely baffled. It went against all rational thought and careful planning. Maybe that is true, Maya said thoughtfully. But humanity did not get to space by being rational and careful. We got here by being stubborn and occasionally reckless and believing we could do things that everyone said were completely impossible. She looked down at the violin in her hands. This instrument was almost destroyed by neglect, and she had not played seriously in years. By any logical measure, tonight should have been a total disaster. But we humans have this weird relationship with logic. We acknowledge it, we respect it, and then we do the impossible thing anyway because it matters to us. Krell was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Then he said something that genuinely surprised her. He wanted to apologize, Lieutenant Collins. Tonight was meant as a deliberate humiliation, a way to put her species in what he considered its proper place in the hierarchy. The Veldari had been the cultural heart of the Assembly for 1,000 years. They saw humanity's arrival as a direct threat to that position, and they responded with cruelty disguised as cultural exchange. The admission hung in the space between them like a physical weight. Maya could have been angry, could have made a serious diplomatic incident of it. Instead, she found herself understanding his position. He was protecting something he valued deeply, she said, his people's identity, their established place in the galaxy. She could not be mad about that motivation. But Ambassador Krell, humanity was not here to replace Veldari culture. They were here to add to it, to contribute their own unique voice to the galactic chorus. There was room for both of them. After tonight, I believe you, Krell said with what sounded like relief. More than that, I find myself hoping you are right. Because if humanity can create such beauty from brokenness, I am very curious to see what you will accomplish when you are whole. The next morning, Maya woke in her small quarters to find herself famous across the Assembly networks. Someone in the audience had recorded her entire performance, and it had spread through both human and alien channels alike, with incredible viral intensity. She had messages waiting from Earth, from the Academy, from people she had not spoken to in years. Her grandmother, now 90 years old and still living in the same small town in Colorado, had sent a simple message that made Maya cry. I knew you would never really quit music, it said. The music was always in you, waiting for the right moment to emerge. But the most significant message came directly from the Assembly Council itself. They were requesting an official meeting with the human delegation, and they specifically asked that Lieutenant Collins be present. Ambassador Hayes briefed the entire team in a secure conference room aboard the human diplomatic ship. The Council wants to accelerate our membership status significantly, Hayes explained, unable to completely hide his satisfaction. Krell has been making calls all night speaking to other cultural representatives. He is arguing that humanity brings something unique to the Assembly, a perspective that could benefit all member species. It is unprecedented in Assembly history. Maya felt completely overwhelmed by the implications. Sir, she protested, she just played a violin. She did not mean to change galactic politics. Hayes smiled warmly at her. The best changes are rarely planned, Lieutenant. She reminded the Assembly of something they had forgotten over their long existence. That value does not come from age or technological advancement or perfect cultural achievement. It comes from authenticity, from the courage to be vulnerable and human, even when everyone expects you to be more. The meeting with the Council was formal but surprisingly warm compared to previous interactions. Species that had barely acknowledged humanity's existence just days before now wanted to establish cultural exchange programs. They wanted to understand human art and literature and music. They wanted to know what other surprises this young species might offer to the galactic community. The Council chamber was an impressive circular room with seating for representatives from all major species. Maya sat beside Ambassador Hayes, acutely aware of how much attention was focused on her. The Council speaker, an elderly Veldari named Thress, addressed the Assembly with great formality. Lieutenant Collins, Thress began, her performance had done something remarkable. She had reminded the Assembly of why they had formed this alliance in the first place. Not for military strength or economic power, but to share the unique perspectives of different civilizations. Humanity, despite being the youngest member species, had already contributed something invaluable. Over the following weeks, Maya found herself attending meeting after meeting. Cultural ministers wanted to discuss exchange programs. Military commanders who had dismissed humans now showed interest in human approaches to problem solving. Even the Veldari Cultural Academy extended an invitation for her to perform and teach. But the most meaningful change came in small interactions throughout the station. Human traders reported better treatment at markets. Human students at the Assembly University found themselves included in study groups that had previously excluded them. The subtle discrimination had not disappeared completely, but it had lessened significantly. 3 months after her performance, Maya stood once again in Ambassador Hayes's office. He had called her in for what he said was an important discussion. She entered to find not just Hayes but Commander Barnes and several other senior officials. Lieutenant Collins, Hayes began formally. The Assembly has created a new position. They are calling it Cultural Ambassador, and they want a human to fill it. More specifically, they want her. The job would involve traveling to different member worlds, sharing human culture, learning from alien cultures, building bridges through art rather than politics. Maya felt her breath catch in her throat. It was an incredible opportunity, but also terrifying. What if her performance had been a one-time thing? What if she could not replicate that success? What if she embarrassed humanity on a larger stage? Hayes seemed to read her thoughts. Nobody expects perfection, he said gently. They want authenticity. They want someone who will show them what humanity really is. That is what you did that night. You did not try to be perfect. You took a broken instrument and made it sing. That is the human story, Maya. We are all broken in some way, but we create beauty anyway. Commander Barnes added her support. The position came with full diplomatic credentials and significant resources. Maya would have a small team, a ship, access to the best human artists and cultural experts. She would not be alone in this mission. Maya thought about her grandmother, about that night in the assembly hall, about the weight of representing humanity to the galaxy. It was terrifying but also exciting. She thought about all the humans out there who still faced discrimination, who needed someone to show the galaxy what they were capable of. She accepted the position. The next 6 months were intense preparation. Maya trained in diplomatic protocol, studied alien cultures, assembled her team. She practiced violin daily, but also explored other human art forms. Music was just one way to communicate. She needed to understand dance, visual arts, literature, film, and more. Her team consisted of 5 other humans, each bringing unique expertise. There was Carmen Rodriguez, a dancer and choreographer. Peter Zhang, a visual artist who worked in both traditional and digital media. Sophie Martin, a writer and poet. Alex Turner, a composer who specialized in blending different musical traditions. And Lieutenant Morrison, who had requested transfer to serve as their military liaison and logistics coordinator. Together, they prepared humanity's first major cultural exchange mission. Their first destination would be the Thaxian homeworld. The Thaxians had no native musical tradition, making them an interesting first stop. They experienced the universe primarily through complex mathematical patterns and had always been baffled by other species' emphasis on what they considered purposeless sound. As their ship prepared to depart from the assembly station, Maya stood once more at an observation viewport. Morrison joined her, grinning as he usually did. Cultural Ambassador Collins, he said with exaggerated formality. Quite a promotion for someone who was just trying not to embarrass Earth. Maya smiled but admitted she was terrified. What if tonight had been a fluke? What if she could not do this consistently? Then you will fail spectacularly and prove you are human, Morrison said cheerfully. That is kind of our thing, is it not? We try impossible things. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed, but we always try. Maya looked at her reflection in the viewport, overlaid against the stars beyond. She thought about her grandmother, about that broken violin, about the moment when she had decided to play the impossible piece instead of the safe one. Maybe that was what being human truly meant, choosing the hard path, the risky path, the path that might end in failure but could also end in something remarkable and meaningful. It meant being willing to be vulnerable in front of others, to risk embarrassment in pursuit of connection. Their ship, the Harmony, was not large, but it was well equipped for their mission. It had space for the crew, a small performance area, storage for equipment and art supplies, and most importantly, excellent communication systems to document and share their experiences with Earth and the Assembly. The journey to the Thaxian homeworld took 2 weeks through established jump routes. During that time, the team worked intensively to prepare their presentation. The challenge with the Thaxians was significant. How do you explain music to a species that perceives the universe through mathematics and has no cultural framework for understanding purposeless aesthetic experience? Carmen suggested they approach it through pattern and movement. Thaxians might not understand music emotionally, but they could appreciate the mathematical complexity of rhythm and structure. Sophie proposed combining poetry with mathematical proofs, finding the beauty in both. Alex worked on compositions that emphasized the mathematical relationships between notes. Maya spent hours with the team, but also alone with her violin. She practiced not just technique, but how to explain what she was doing in terms Thaxians might comprehend. Why did certain note combinations create emotional responses in humans? What was the relationship between mathematical ratios and perceived beauty? When they finally arrived at the Thaxian homeworld, Maya was struck by its stark beauty. The planet was covered in geometric cities, massive structures built according to precise mathematical principles. Everything was ordered, logical, purposeful. There seemed to be no room for the chaotic beauty of art. The Thaxian greeting committee met them at the spaceport. The lead Thaxian, whose name translated roughly to Equation 794, welcomed them with curious interest. The Thaxians had heard about Maya's performance at the assembly. They did not understand it, but they recognized it had significant impact. They wanted to understand why sound patterns mattered to other species. The presentation was scheduled for the following day in the Central Calculation Forum, the closest thing Thaxians had to a cultural center. Maya and her team spent the evening making final preparations and dealing with their own nervousness. This was their first official mission. Success here could open doors across the galaxy. Failure could undermine everything they hoped to achieve. That night, Maya could not sleep. She stood in her assigned quarters looking out at the geometric cityscape. She thought about the challenge ahead. The Thaxians were not hostile like Krell had been. They were genuinely curious. But how do you bridge such a fundamental gap in perception and understanding? She picked up her violin and began to play softly, not the Zigeunerweisen this time, but something simpler. Bach's Chaconne, a piece built on mathematical variation and repetition. As she played, she thought about what her grandmother had taught her. Music was not just sound. It was emotion translated into pattern. It was human feeling made tangible. The next morning, the team gathered in the Central Calculation Forum. The space was enormous, filled with Thaxians who had come to observe this strange human ritual. Unlike the assembly hall, there was no hostility here, just intense curiosity from beings who genuinely wanted to understand. Maya stepped forward to begin. She did not start with music. Instead, she started with a question. She asked the Thaxians what they felt when they solved a particularly elegant mathematical proof. Several Thaxians responded. They described something they called resonance, a sense of correctness and beauty when numbers aligned properly. Maya smiled. That feeling, she explained, was similar to what humans experienced with music. Music was mathematics made audible. When notes combined in certain ratios, it created resonance in human consciousness. She demonstrated by playing simple intervals, explaining the mathematical relationships. A perfect fifth was a 3-to-2 ratio. An octave was 2-to-1. The Thaxians were listening intently now. This was something they could understand. Mathematics they knew. She continued, showing how rhythm was division of time, how melody was sequence, how harmony was simultaneous equation. Music was not purposeless sound. It was mathematical beauty translated into an auditory form that resonated with human neurology. Then she began to play the Chaconne. As she played, Alex provided running commentary explaining the mathematical structure. The piece was built on a simple bass line that repeated with variations. Each variation was a transformation of the original pattern, exploring different mathematical relationships while maintaining coherence. The Thaxians were responding in ways Maya had not expected. They began to sway slightly, their bodies responding to the rhythm even though they did not consciously understand why. The mathematical patterns in the music were speaking to something deep in their own perception. Carmen joined the performance, dancing to the music. Her movements were precise and geometric, emphasizing the mathematical relationships Maya was playing. Sophie recited poetry that used mathematical concepts as metaphors. Peter projected visual patterns that synchronized with the music, showing the mathematics visually. It was a multi-sensory presentation that approached art from every angle the Thaxians might understand. And slowly, gradually, Maya could see comprehension dawning. The Thaxians were beginning to understand not just what music was, but why it mattered. After the performance ended, there was no applause. Thaxians did not clap. Instead, Equation 794 approached Maya with what she had learned to recognize as excitement in Thaxian body language. "This was remarkable," he said. They had always dismissed music as inefficient communication, but they had not understood it was mathematical communication operating on a different level. This changed their entire perception. More Thaxians gathered around asking questions. Could they learn to create music? Could mathematics be translated into music? Could music help them understand other species better? The enthusiasm was overwhelming and genuine. Over the next week, Maya and her team conducted workshops and demonstrations across the Thaxian homeworld. They taught basic music theory to Thaxians who had never considered such concepts. They showed how different cultures use different mathematical systems in their music. They explored the boundaries between pure mathematics and aesthetic beauty. The impact was profound. Thaxian scientists began incorporating musical concepts into their research. They discovered that certain complex equations could be more easily understood when translated into musical patterns. Educational institutions requested human musicians to teach courses. The Thaxians were experiencing a cultural revolution. But more importantly for Maya's mission, the Thaxians became advocates for humanity. They sent reports to the assembly explaining how human approaches to art and mathematics were complementary, rather than contradictory. They argued that humanity's unique perspective was valuable precisely because it was different. When the harmony finally departed the Thaxian homeworld, Maya felt a sense of accomplishment she had never experienced before. They had succeeded not by forcing human culture on the Thaxians, but by finding common ground, by showing how different perspectives could enrich each other. Their next destination was the Xanthi homeworld, a completely different challenge. The Xanthi were already highly artistic. Their light symphonies were famous across the galaxy. The question was not whether they valued art, but whether they could accept human art as legitimate, given how different it was from their own traditions. The journey gave the team time to rest and prepare. Morrison organized their schedule and logistics. Carmen developed new choreography. Alex composed pieces that attempted to blend human and Xanthi musical concepts. Sophie wrote extensively about their Thaxian experience, documenting everything for Earth. Maya spent time reflecting on what they had learned. Each species perceived beauty differently based on their biology and culture. The key was not to argue that human art was better, but to show how it added another voice to the galactic conversation, unity through diversity rather than homogeneity. The Xanthi homeworld was beautiful in ways that took Maya's breath away. The cities glowed with bioluminescent architecture. The Xanthi themselves were luminous beings, their bodies creating complex light patterns as they communicated. Everything on this world was visual, bright, alive with color. Their contact was Velshara, the same diplomat who had approached Maya after her performance at the assembly. She welcomed the team warmly. The Xanthi were eager to understand human art better. They had been moved by Maya's violin performance but did not fully understand why. They wanted to explore this mystery. The challenge here was different from the Thaxian mission. The Xanthi understood art deeply. They did not need to be convinced of its value, but they perceived the universe primarily through vision. Sound was secondary for them. How could Maya help them understand music when their primary sense was so different? The solution came from an unexpected source. Peter, the visual artist, suggested they create a synesthetic performance. They would translate music into visual patterns in real time, letting the Xanthi see the music as well as hear it. Carmen could add movement. Together they could create something that bridged the gap between human and Xanthi perception. They spent days preparing. Alex created special software that analyzed music and generated corresponding light patterns based on Xanthi aesthetic principles. Peter designed visual elements that would complement rather than compete with the music. Carmen choreographed movements that incorporated Xanthi light dance traditions. The performance was scheduled in the Grand Luminarium, the center of Xanthi cultural life. Thousands of Xanthi gathered, their bodies creating a shifting sea of light. Maya felt nervous in a different way than before. The Thaxians had been curious but not judgmental. The Xanthi were sophisticated art critics. They would notice every flaw. As the lights dimmed, Maya took a deep breath. She had chosen to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece that was inherently visual in its imagery. As she began to play, Alex's software translated each note into flowing patterns of light that filled the luminarium. Peter's projections added depth and texture. Carmen danced, her movements echoing the music's flow. The effect was stunning. The Xanthi were seeing music for the first time, understanding it through their primary sense. The flowing melodies became streams of light. The harmonies became complementary colors. The rhythm became pulsing patterns. It was music transformed into a language the Xanthi could truly understand. But something more happened. The Xanthi began to respond with their own light patterns, improvising along with the performance. Their bodies created counterpoint, harmonizing with the music in their own visual language. It became a true collaboration, human and Xanthi art merging into something entirely new. When the piece ended, the luminarium was filled with light as every Xanthi present expressed their appreciation through their bioluminescence. It was the most beautiful thing Maya had ever seen, a visual standing ovation. Velshara approached with her patterns pulsing in complex sequences. She explained that the Xanthi had always believed their light symphonies were the pinnacle of art, because they engaged the most important sense. But tonight they learned that beauty could emerge from any sense, any perspective. By translating music into light, the humans had built a bridge between cultures. By respecting Xanthi perception while sharing human art, they had created something greater than either culture alone. The next weeks on the Xanthi homeworld were transformative for both species. Xanthi artists collaborated with human musicians to create hybrid art forms. They taught Maya and her team about their light compositions. The humans taught the Xanthi about auditory beauty. Cultural barriers dissolved as genuine artistic exchange flourished. Maya realized that this was the true power of art. It transcended language, biology, even fundamental differences in perception. When approached with openness and respect, art could unite species that seemed to have nothing in common. The key was not insisting that others adopt human perspectives, but finding ways to share and blend perspectives into something new. As they prepared to leave the Xanthi homeworld, Maya received a message from Ambassador Hayes. The Assembly Council had been following their mission closely. The success with both the Thaxians and Xanthi had impressed even the most skeptical members. There was growing momentum for granting humanity full membership status ahead of schedule. More than that, other species were requesting visits from the Cultural Ambassador team. The next 6 months were a whirlwind of travel and performance. Maya and her team visited a dozen worlds, each presenting unique challenges and opportunities. They performed for the Century, whose species experienced sound through vibrations in their rocky exoskeletons. They shared poetry with the Veliks, whose language had 17 different words for types of sadness. They taught painting to the Krun, whose species had only recently developed visual art. Each world taught them something new. Each performance was adapted to the audience, respecting their biology and culture while sharing human creativity. And everywhere they went, perceptions of humanity changed. The young, brash species that had seemed so inferior was revealing unexpected depths. But the most important invitation came from an unexpected source. The Veldari Cultural Academy, the most prestigious artistic institution in the galaxy, invited Maya to perform and lecture. It was Ambassador Krell himself who extended the invitation. He wanted the galaxy's artistic elite to understand what he had learned that night in the assembly hall. Maya felt the weight of this opportunity. The Veldari Academy had never invited a human before. Many Veldari still believed their culture was superior to all others. This performance would be her most important yet, not because of politics, but because it represented a chance to truly change hearts and minds at the highest levels of galactic culture. The team arrived at the Veldari homeworld to find a planet of stunning crystalline beauty. Everything seemed to resonate with music. The architecture itself was designed to create harmonics. The Veldari had spent thousands of years perfecting their world as an instrument. Krell greeted them personally, his demeanor completely different from their first meeting. He had become an advocate for human culture, but he was also honest about the challenge ahead. Many Veldari still dismissed human art as primitive. The Academy audience would be skeptical and judgmental. Maya would need to give the performance of her life. The night before the performance, Maya could not sleep. She walked through the crystalline garden surrounding their quarters, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. That night in the assembly hall felt like it had happened to someone else. She was different now, more confident in her abilities, more understanding of what she represented. She found Krell standing near a resonating fountain, its waters creating musical tones. He acknowledged her presence with a gesture of welcome. She asked him why he had changed his mind about humanity, why he had become their advocate. Krell was quiet for a moment before responding. He explained that the Veldari had grown complacent in their cultural dominance. They believed they had perfected art, that nothing new could be discovered. But Maya's performance had shown him how wrong that belief was. She had taken a broken instrument and created something that moved him more deeply than performances he had heard from the greatest Veldari masters. That should not have been possible according to Veldari understanding of art. He realized then that perfection was not the highest achievement. Connection was. Maya had connected with her audience in a way that transcended technical mastery. She had been vulnerable, had risked failure, and that risk made the beauty more meaningful. The Veldari had forgotten how to take such risks because they feared imperfection. Maya understood what he was saying. The Veldari had achieved technical perfection, but in doing so they had lost something essential. They had become so focused on flawless execution that they had forgotten art was supposed to communicate genuine emotion, not just demonstrate skill. The performance at the Veldari Academy was scheduled for the following evening. The hall was smaller than the assembly chamber but more intimidating. Every seat was filled with Veldari cultural masters, beings who had spent centuries perfecting their craft. They sat in judgment, waiting to see if this human truly deserved the attention she had received. Maya walked onto the stage holding the same battered violin from that first performance. She had kept it, had it carefully preserved. It was still imperfect, still flawed, but those flaws were part of its voice now. She would not play on a perfect instrument tonight. That would miss the point entirely. She did not begin with music. Instead, she spoke. She thanked the Academy for the invitation and acknowledged the Veldari's achievements in art. But she said she was not here to compete with Veldari culture or claim human superiority. She was here to share a different perspective, to show that beauty could emerge from imperfection, that vulnerability was not weakness, but strength. Then she began to play. Not the Zigeunerweisen this time, but something she and Alex had composed together. It was called Kreshva, named for the Veldari concept of art born from struggle. The piece incorporated elements of both human and Veldari musical traditions, a deliberate fusion of cultures. The music started quietly, tentatively, like the opening of her first performance. But it grew, building in complexity and emotion. Maya played with everything she had learned over the past months. She played for the Thaxians who had learned to hear beauty in mathematics. She played for the Xanthi, who had learned to see music in light. She played for every species who had opened their hearts to human art. But most of all, she played for the Veldari themselves. She played to show them that their quest for perfection, while admirable, was not the only path to beauty. She played to demonstrate that flaws and struggle and imperfection were not obstacles to overcome, but essential elements of meaningful art. The audience was completely silent as she played. Maya could see some Veldari resonating with the music, their crystalline bodies responding. She could see others struggling to understand, to accept this different approach to art. But they were all listening, truly listening. The final notes faded into the hall's perfect acoustics. Maya lowered her violin and waited. The silence stretched for what felt like hours. Then slowly, Ambassador Krell stood. He began the highest Veldari acknowledgement of artistic merit. Others joined him one by one until the entire academy was on their feet. It was not unanimous. Some Veldari remained seated, still unconvinced. But that was fine. Maya had not expected to convert everyone. The point was not to make everyone think the same way, but to open minds to new possibilities. After the performance, the Academy Masters invited Maya to give a series of lectures on human approaches to art. They wanted to understand not just the music, but the philosophy behind it. What did humanity believe about beauty? How did being a young species with short lives influence human creativity? Why did humans value emotional authenticity over technical perfection? Maya spent 2 weeks at the Academy, teaching and learning. She discovered that even the most skeptical Veldari were curious once they moved past their initial resistance. They had questions about human history, human psychology, human dreams and fears. Art became a lens through which they could understand humanity more broadly. When it was finally time to leave, Krell presented Maya with a gift. It was a Veldari crystal instrument, perfectly crafted and incredibly valuable. She tried to refuse something so precious, but Krell insisted. He said it was not just a gift to her, but a symbol of Veldari acceptance of humanity as cultural equals. The inscription read simply, for showing us that perfection is not the destination but the journey.